Join me as I visit Wayland Smithy, a 5,600-year-old long barrow, or burial tomb in Oxfordshire. Wayland Smithy is very close to the Uffington chalk horse, the remains of an early Iron Age hill fort called Uffington Castle, and parts of the Ridgeway, which is Britain's oldest road. We drove along the B4507 from Swindon heading east and parked in the National Trust's White Horse Hill car park. It's less than a 2-mile walk from there. It was an extremely foggy day, which really contributed to the atmosphere. In the summer, it's stunningly beautiful here, but the sharp cold and the thick fog made it feel really oppressive today, which feels appropriate given that this is an ancient tomb.
So I'm walking along the Ridgeway and it's suddenly much, much colder, which I think lends plenty of credibility to all the fantastic ghost stories.
All the versions of this story start with a midwife being called out to a labouring mother at a farm a few miles away. It was after dark, but the moon was nearly full, so she wasn't concerned. The midwife got dressed in a hurry and grabbed her cloak and bag whilst her daughter saddled their faster horse. When they bought the horse, they specifically looked for a swift, sure-footed horse, because the midwife knew that lives would depend on her getting to her patients quickly. So it was not unusual for her to ride off into the night quicker than most people would dare. The bright moonlight reflected off the chalk ridgeway, so the path ahead was clear, but the thick hedges on each side of the road meant that the midwife didn't have a good view of her surroundings as she cantered through the night. The wind was roaring in her ears and her mind was racing, so she didn't hear it the first time. But there it was again, a whisper calling her. The midwife looked sharply to her right and saw a figure darting through a field gateway and following the hedge line parallel to her on the other side of the thick hawthorn. Every now and again she caught a glimpse of the figure through the hedge, and she was astonished that they managed to keep up with her on foot in the rough terrain of the field as she cantered along the smooth road. The whisper calling her was urgent, desperate even, and nearly constant by now. The midwife felt certain that if the figure caught her, her patient would not be the only one whose life was in danger that night. She knew the Ridgeway well, and she knew that there was only one more field with a gateway opening onto her path before she reached the yard of the farm she'd been called to. So as she turned the corner, she loosened her reins and kicked her horse on into a full gallop, certain that her horse on the smooth chalk could outpace any human running through the tall crops and jumping the puddles and fallen branches on the other side of the hedge. She heard the figure fall behind, and as she came clattering and skidding into the courtyard, the midwife turned around and saw the shadow retreat back into the field. She handed the reins of her horse to the farmhand and ran upstairs to greet her patient and start work. The midwife did not return home that night, so at dawn her daughter packed up some additional supplies, mounted the slower horse and followed her mother's path. She trotted along the road until she heard a heart-wrenching scream come from the field on her right. At the next gap in the hedge, she turned into the field to see if there was anything she could do to help. But the field looked tranquil in the weak morning sunlight. There was no one there. There was also no damage to crops, no footprints in the soft ground, and no evidence at all that someone had sprinted along the tree line, jumping the streams and branches and tearing through the crops the night before. Although the girl couldn't possibly have known that there should be, so she rode further into the field calling as she went, searching for the voice which had sounded so desperate. Meanwhile, the midwife, her patient, and the family had celebrated the birth of a healthy baby a few hours before dawn, and the midwife had waited until sunrise to ride home. She left the happy family with a cheerful wave, mounted her horse and set off along the road. As she turned the corner, she remembered the voice from the previous night and wondered who or what it had been. She listened carefully in case it was still there, but all she heard was the peaceful singing of the birds. But her peace was shattered the moment she got home and discovered that her daughter had left to assist her over an hour ago and never arrived. The midwife was immediately hit by a wave of dread. There was no way they could have missed each other on the Ridgeway, and no other route her daughter could possibly have taken. She turned around and retraced her steps, frantically calling as she went. When she reached the first gateway which opened onto the Ridgeway, the midwife went in to see if she could see any sign of her missing daughter. There were hoofprints in the soft mud, and she found the horse contentedly eating the grass, but there was no sign of the girl. They summoned a search party with volunteers from every local farm and hundreds of people who came from the villages all around. They searched until sunset without finding a trace. As darkness fell and the searchers made their way home, there were now 2 shadowy figures on the other side of the hedge, whispering, calling unsuspecting victims to join them. I hope the ghost story kept you entertained for the walk from the car park.
So just around the corner is Wayland Smithy. It's a long barrow, which is a Neolithic burial mound.
The oldest human remains found here were buried between 3,600 and 3,550 BCE, in a much smaller burial chamber than the one we can see today. It had a stone floor and wooden walls, and it was the grave to at least 9 men, 4 women and a child. We know very little about them. It's not even clear whether the flint arrowheads found amongst their remains imply that they met a brutal end, or whether it means they were warriors. It seems likely that they would have been part of the social elite to be buried in such an elaborate grave, but even that we cannot be sure of. About a century later, between 3460 and 3400 BCE, this larger, more elaborate long barrow was built over the top of the previous one.
Both of them would have served as a kind of focus for ceremonies that kind of marked the connection between the living and the dead, which is an interesting thought, to know that so many people would have been buried here and so many people would have come here as part of rituals.
But it's the facade of Wayland's smithy that attracts attention. The front of the barrow had a dry stone retaining wall. When it was built, there would have been 6 of these huge stones. At some point the tomb was robbed, but the remains of 7 adults and a child were found here. These individuals were buried within a 100-year period, before the long barrow was sealed off. We're less than 2 miles from the ruins of Uffington Castle, but the people laid to rest here had already been dead for 2,800 years before the castle builders started work. It's strange to think that when the Romans arrived in Britain, Wayland's smithy was already ancient. We live closer in time to the Romans than the Romans did to the people who were buried here. The Saxons of the early Middle Ages created legends around this structure, which was already 4,000 years old. It's from their stories that we get the name Wayland's smithy. Wayland was a Saxon god, and the master blacksmith in Germanic and Norse mythology. His story is told in an Icelandic poem in the Poetic Edda, which tells of his capture by the king who forced him to work. He killed the king's sons and escaped to live in this long barrow. There's an old tale that if your horse lost a shoe on the road, you could leave it tied up here overnight with a coin to pay the smith, and in the morning your horse would have been shod by the invisible blacksmith. Wayland's smithy is also connected to a legend with the nearby Uffington White Horse, which was cut in around 1000 BCE, when the long barrow was about 2,500 years old. Legend says that once every century the white horse gets down from its place on the hill and canters over to Wayland's smithy to be reshod. I'll make a different video about my visit to the Uffington White Horse.